Welcome to the Tao of Our Understanding Recovery Podcast. In this podcast, we discuss mystical works of literature and how they relate to recovery. We hope you enjoy today's podcast episode.
Hello, this is Buddy C. Welcome to the Tao of Understanding Recovery Podcast. Today we have Brian and Drew and Lou and Paul. Good to have you guys today. Remember, if anyone out there in podcast land would like to join in, you're welcome to. We meet every Saturday morning at 9 a.m. Eastern. We have a private Facebook group by the same name as the podcast, where we post meeting links and other information about the podcast. Also a good place that we can converse about anything mentioned or discussed or any other Tao related, anything recovery related. I love it because it's a place that if I'm studying or let's say I'm meditating and something comes to mind that I'm using as an affirmation, I can post that in there. I can post anything in there that has to do with my recovery, mostly Tao related, that I couldn't post in other groups because they just weren't as receptive. So rather than just an AA, quote, AA group, it's a group that we can, if this is speaking to us, sometimes, things speak to us that doesn't speak to other folks. So we can use this to discuss and share and those type things. So join in with us. We'd love to have you. And then if you're not in Facebook, you can always message me at info@buddyc.org. And I'll send you links and all that type of stuff. So lots of resources also at buddyc.org that you may put to use. All right, the 53rd verse of the Tao Te Ching. Let's start with the Stephen Mitchell. Would you read that for us, Drew?
Sure. The great way is easy, yet people prefer the side paths. Be aware when things are out of balance. Stay centered within the Tao. When rich speculators prosper while farmers lose their land, when government officials spend money on weapons instead of cures, when the upper class is extravagant and irresponsible while the poor have nowhere to turn, all this is robbery and chaos. It is not keeping with the Tao.
Thank you, Drew. Brian, do you have Derek Lynn handy?
I sure do. Let's see. If I have a little knowledge, walking on the great Tao, I fear only to deviate from it. The great Tao is broad and plain, but people like the side paths. The courts are corrupt, the fields are barren, the warehouses are empty. Officials wear fineries, carry sharp swords, fill up on drinks and food, acquire excessive wealth. This is called robbery. It is not the Tao.
Thank you. This is Jonathan Starr. If I had the least bit of wisdom, I could follow the path of the Tao quite well. My only fear would be trying to go my own way. The great path is simple and direct, yet people love to take the side routes. See how magnificent the courts have become. The women dress in colorful gowns. The men carry well-crafted swords. Food and drink overflow. Wealth and finery abound. Yet in the shadow of all this splendor, the fields grow barren. The granaries are all but empty. I say this pomp at the expense of others is like the boasting of thieves after a looting. Surely it is contrary to Tao. Surely it cuts against the grain of the whole empire. Any other translations anyone would like to share?
Do you have yours, Andy?
I do. My one fear, if I had a fear, it would be straying from this way. This way is broad and easy, but I prefer to take side roads and shortcuts. I prefer to talk about spiritual axioms while I conceal anger and resentment. Sometimes these hit very close to home. I like to sound spiritual in meetings and pretend I do not feel I am better than others. This behavior is far from the way and always leads me toward a drink. Of course, this is not a true. My book is a interpretation, not a translation. So what I did was sit with the verse and look at some of the original Chinese and just wrote what bubbled up from that verse. But yeah, I prefer to talk about spiritual axioms while I conceal anger and resentment. Sometimes I wish I was not so honest on these. Yeah. Any thoughts, Brian?
Buddy, what comes up for me is I've told people several times that the solution never changes, that it's always recovery. And, I've tried to work recovery around problems that I have outside of my addiction. Like I remember the time you talked about working recovery around your business, working the steps around that. And I'm not saying I'm a spiritual guru and I have all the answers and I do this every time, but it's just, it comes back to there's always a solution, and that is recovery. That could be the Tao, that could be surrender. And if we deviate from it, I've heard other people say my best ideas brought me here.
Yeah.
That's it.
It's interesting, Brian, how we think that's so difficult, but the first thought in this verse 53 brings us to part of what you're talking about there. It says the great way is easy. Man, to be so easy, I have had such a difficult time with it. It's been anything but easy in my thinking. It says a great way is easy if I had the least bit of wisdom, is the way Starr put it. And it just seems the opposite when I came in. I almost died, literally, trying to apply recovery to my life. And people die every day sincerely wanting to recover and are unable. Every day people die that are very sincere about seeking recovery. Why is that? Oh, before I forget, congratulations, Paul, 15 years today, correct?
Yes, that is correct.
Hey, congratulations, Paul.
I'll tell you what my first sponsor told me after a year. Congratulations on doing every day what millions of people do with no fanfare whatsoever. Congratulations.
Yeah. I love that one. Yeah. Congratulations.
Well, I was going to ask him how he did it, but I won't now.
No, ask him. How'd you do it, Paul?
How'd you do it, Paul?
Actually, it ties into the verse today. I keep it simple. I don't overthink it. I think, Buddy, just to kind of piggyback on what you were just saying, why do people who sincerely are seeking recovery? I think it's because they truly don't surrender. They want to have some form of control over this addiction, which there is no controlling. The addiction controls you, not the other way around. And believe me, it took me twice as long as I've been sober now as how long it took me to figure that out. It took me nearly 30 years of drinking to figure that out. So yeah, anytime I want to puff my chest out and say, I've got 15 years. Well, hey, guess what? I'm about halfway to where I was in my drinking career. So I'm not getting a big head over any of this stuff. It's truly for me just been one day at a time. All the cliches in recovery, they're cliches for a reason, because they work. When I first got in recovery, I thought I was one of the biggest cynics you'd ever want to meet. All these people, they think it's so great. They're not drinking. What do they know? No, but boy, they were right. And I just have to, like I said, people ask me how I do it. I say, I just get up in the morning and say, of course I do my gratitude practice. I was going to mention that, but And that's truly been if I had to pick one thing that's helped me, it's been that gratitude practice. And that's why I talk about it so much, because it really has been the key to my recovery. But I guess the other key was that surrender and keeping it simple and not getting sidetracked, not going down those side roads. Focus on, and I have to focus on that every single day, not to the point of being obsessive about it. In fact, there's many days I don't even really, it doesn't really enter my consciousness that, life has its ups and downs. And one of the big reasons I started drinking in the first place is I couldn't deal with those ups and downs. Recovery gave me the tools to deal with that. And, it's not all a bed of roses, this recovery thing, but it's still, I think I heard one time, my worst day in recovery beats the best day of my drinking. So I try to hang on to that one too. So I love the cliches. I'm a big cliche guy.
Thank you, Paul. Congratulations.
Hey, Paul, I was wondering if you could describe your gratitude practice a little.
Yeah. Again, it's pretty simple. Every morning I go to a website called Sober Recovery, and we have a daily gratitude thread. And that is where I go to, I list like maybe 2 or 3 things per day. And it's where everybody else lists their gratitude. So not only do I list mine, but I also read everybody else's, and that we kind of feed off each other. We call ourselves the Grat Pack.
Mm-hmm.
Kind of feed off.
I like that.
And and so that's really all there is to it. And if I'm having a particularly stressful day, I'll often go back in my head, and I just happen to do it in the morning. I mean, you can do it any time of day. Some people do it when they go to bed at night or whatever, but yeah, I find myself leaning on it quite a bit. And it's just a reminder that, to be grateful. And a lot of times it's just the little things, just grateful to have a roof over my head, grateful to have a working vehicle, grateful for the bathroom at Walmart when I need it.
Mm-hmm.
And sometimes you have to use that bathroom at Walmart, whether you want to or not. So yeah, it's just, that's all there is to it. And like I said, that's the one thing that, because when I was in addiction, I was the opposite of grateful. I was not grateful. I felt that the world owed me, and, obviously, I mean, if you would have known me back then, you would say, who is this guy talking to you right now? It's not the same person. So it's just, I think in one of the other online, and buddy, I still have my perfect record, by the way. I've never been to an in-person meeting yet, but
I want you to break that record sometime, Paul. You would love it. I guarantee you. I'm just waiting for the day. I'm not mentioning it ever. I don't mention it, but I'm just waiting for buddy, you were right. I just fit in so well. So many people are there.
Well, again,
he's waiting for the buddy. You were right.
Yeah, that's really what I'm waiting on. You're exactly.
No, again, I'm keeping it simple. I'm doing what works for me. So I'm not going to get sidetracked with any, as well intentioned as Buddy is with that. No, but
it's
hey,
almost a picking at you at this point, Paul. It's not a,
No, I know. I don't mind it, but no, it's just incredible. And I never want to forget where I was 15 years ago today. I was literally, I get emotional when I think about it, because, I literally wanted to die. And I'm so glad I found recovery, and so glad that I'd made that surrender, because it literally saved my life. So thanks for letting me share that, guys.
Of course.
Thanks, Paul. We're glad you're here.
Yes, sir.
And is that soberrecovery.com or .org or something?
Yeah. It's just soberrecovery.com.
Yeah.
Yeah, I found it. I was actually about a month into my recovery when I decided that I was going to need some extra support. And so instead of the in-person meetings, I decided to do that, because I really do. I am busy, and, but not to use that as an excuse, but I found my tribe. And so that's, like I said, it works for me. So.
Thank you.
And that's what matters, Paul, is finding what works. And it's just like when we say it's the God of our understanding. It's the God of your understanding. It's what works for you. It's not what works for someone else or someone else's God of their understanding. It's the God of your understanding. So, yeah, that's great. Thank you. Thank you. Any other comments at this point, guys? It's that paradox of if the great way or the path of sobriety or is easy, for me, the next part of that stanza is, yet people prefer the side paths. If you ask me what time it is, I'll build you a watch. I won't just tell you what time it is. And it's some of that in that rather than just doing what is in front of me, I'll look in my thinking, try to figure out all these other ways and these other things instead of just doing what's presented to me. And I still do that. I'll do that about anything if I'm not careful. And I think the path of sobriety is easy and wide and all those things is because it is so simple. And Paul touched on it. It's the path of surrender. It's the path of letting go, which of course is the opposite of what I was taught in other areas of life or with anything before. I was never told to surrender. I was always told the opposite. If you don't understand something, what do? You take a class, you learn a little more, and you try twice as hard. You double down. Yep. Paul put a comment at soberrecovery.com, and it's free to become a member. So there, guys, if you guys want that out and you listen to the podcast, it's soberrecovery.com. Also, too, we don't have to understand sobriety for sobriety to work for us. It doesn't take mental understanding. It just takes doing the action. And that's one thing that's different here too. Be aware when things are out of balance. Stay centered within the Tao. How do I know when things are out of balance? How about when I lose my peace? Do you guys have situations where I just feel upset or irritable and discontent and don't know why? Brian?
Yesterday we went to orientation at the university. My youngest is heading down there in August, and man, I had a lot of energy around it. And my wife's had a lot of energy around it. And anyway, we walk into this big room and there's all these people sitting in there, and I was like, well, there's no freaking seats. And we were there early. And I made the comment to my wife. I said, this is kind of ridiculous. They need to get some more seats. And immediately she kind of gave me some little retaliatory attack. I don't remember exactly what it was. We wasn't fighting, but I didn't like the energy. And I said, well, let's walk up front. And I'd be damned if we didn't walk up front. And like the first 15 rows, there's like just people sprinkled in, and I was just like, Brian, what the hell is wrong with you? Like that was old behavior. You immediately switch to the negative. And so anyway, matter of fact, I think it's probably something I need to make an amends for and discuss with my wife, because she listens to the podcast sometimes. So she'll, but that just come to mind for me.
It's amazing how we start being more aware of those little ways that we dig, that chip it, especially those we love the most. That I never was even aware of in the past.
What is that they say? If it's hysterical, it's historical. So if it's spinning me up, it's the first thing I need to look at is what is it triggering in me?
Yes. When the rich speculators prosper while farmers lose their land, when government officials spend money on weapons instead of cures, when the upper class is extravagant and irresponsible while the poor have nowhere to turn, all this is robbery and chaos. It's not keeping with the Tao. Now, just because speculators are prospering does not necessarily mean that farmers are losing their land. But when? All of these are when, right? So how would this apply to recovery? Drew?
Yeah, I definitely remember going through this book for the first time, and probably the first few times, and taking these literally. That a passage like this was written for the speculators, for the government officials, for the upper class. Telling the reader how society needed to change or be better or stuff like that. But like you were saying, these can all apply to ourselves. So how does this apply to me? How can I put these into action? What is this analogy for in my life? And when rich speculators prosper while farmers lose their land, I can take that as if I'm trying to gain too much, if that's on my mind, if those are my desires, acquiring more, getting more, whether it's at the expense of someone else or the expense of, my own internal well-being, at the expense of how I treat the people in my life, how I talk to myself, how I view myself. That's kind of how I take that analogy to my life. When government officials spend money on weapons instead of cures, I kind of look at that as when I'm spending my resources, my internal resources, on defending or attacking rather than, curing, rather than making things better, making things right, helping people, doing that sort of thing, helping myself. When the upper class is extravagant and irresponsible while the poor have nowhere to turn, I can see that as being self-centered, just selfishness when I'm focused on my own desires at the expense of helping others again, or just sitting and waiting for the next right action to come up. That's kind of how I take that and apply it to my life. So yeah, all of these little analogies, I can find ways to make them about. I mean, I hate to say make them about me, because making things about me is part of the problem a lot of times. But you know what I mean. Taking these.
Isn't there an awareness that comes along that we are able to see more clearly when we're starting to make things about us that shouldn't be? You're talking about noticing that is what you're
Right.
really saying. That
Right.
happened in the past, and I would never even notice it at all.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. No, that's a really good distinction to make. But yeah, I really like this chapter. I think the second part ties in with the first about, what are these side paths? What are your side paths? Is it seeking out novelty? Is it seeking out approval from others? Is it seeking out, acquiring things? What are the things that take you away from that, the broad open path that get you, side paths can be interesting, but you can get lost in them. You can get caught in briars and, get run into, the snakes or, bears or stuff like that. So yeah, what are your own side paths? That's kind of what I get out of this chapter.
Thank you, Drew.
Yeah, I don't think I have a desire for sharp swords or fancy weapons unless you think of the latest smartphone. And I have to think, what do I really need a better smartphone for? What am I going to do with it that I don't do with the one I have, other than it looks cooler or people think it's cool? Yeah, so I think this translates to my life and things that I have a tendency to wander away from and have to hopefully ground myself on.
Thank you, Luke. For me, my side roads have to do with my ego mostly. I have opportunities at times to name drop or bring attention to me. Maybe something I've written or mention all those things that a lot of people in the recovery community, even in my local AA group, don't know I write, don't know about the podcast. They're starting to know some of that, but I was out to eat with some friends and somebody knew, and I didn't mention anything about anything because I don't need to bring all of that to someone's attention. You know, I can tell where that's coming from my ego. You know, I could hide that in a genuine desire to help, you know, kind of thing. You know, I've come to the conclusion that I need to allow others to toot my horn, you know. I don't need to, you know. And I notice when I'm doing that, my family doesn't know anything about any of this. I mean, I could easily, you know, they ask what I've been doing. And if somebody in recovery that's a friend of mine that knows, well, I've been writing. And what are you writing now? You know, and because I want to spend time writing is what I think I need to be doing ultimately. But when my family asks, I've been doing this and this. I never mention writing. I never mention anything about, I mean, my own brother doesn't even know I write this stuff. I mean, that kind of thing. You know, I keep it very personal because in the environment that I would share would be coming from a place of ego. It would not be coming from a place, from any other place. Now, if it were something, if he were to have I have two brothers, but if either of them would have had a problem with alcohol, let's say, or something where it could be helpful, maybe. But there's a lot of other things I can point them to in recovery than just what I've done, you know, and I've done very minimal, you know, in the scope of things. So I have to watch it because I want to promote me. I want to talk about how great I am, you know, that kind of thing, but do it in the humblest of ways. So I have to watch that because and I've mentioned this before. In the past, I had a sponsee that had a podcast, and he still got the podcast. And I found myself listening to he would meet with me and then record his podcast for the week. So we would meet and then he would record and I would listen to his podcast when it came out. And I found myself listening to see if he mentioned me or not. And I'm like, oh, that's not good. But I did. I'd find myself. And then once he mentioned me, a lot of times I'd go to another podcast. I wouldn't even finish, you know, and I said, oh, that's awful. I said, what do I do about that? So I told him about it. And I was on his podcast occasionally. And the next time I was on his podcast, I just mentioned it on the podcast. I said, I won't have to listen today to see if you mention me and tell the story, you know. And once I told the story and got it out, I found I was not doing that anymore. So it's kind of crazy that once I put the light on the issue, got it out like we do a fourth and fifth step, it was no longer an issue. That doesn't work every time, but it definitely worked in that situation. So what do we do about it? Maybe we just shine some light on it. You know, we get rid of the secret. You know, sometimes that's appropriate and sometimes it's not. This was a situation where it was. I would suggest at least talking to your sponsor about it. That's a great thing about having a sponsor. You can run these things by them and see what they thought you should do with it. But yeah, those side paths and shortcuts can be detrimental to us. Any other comments?
Buddy, I'm just wondering if one of your relatives asked you, what'd you do this afternoon? And you had been writing all afternoon, and you told them you'd been writing all afternoon. how do you think that conversation would go from there?
I don't know. I've been very private about my recovery. It depends on why I am telling them that I'm writing, Drew.
Mm-hmm.
If that's from a place of ego and pride, that's one thing. Or if it's coming from a place of genuinely being helpful, because I know that if they're in need of help, what helps them is not me would not be me or my writing. What would help them would be my experience in recovery, because that's where I believe the real, where God is, so to speak, is in my experience and how it's worked for me. Me talking about writing recovery stuff is really not talking about my experience. That's just what I'm doing. If that makes sense, there's a distinction there for me. And the less I can talk about me, the better, as far as what Buddy does. I don't know if does that make sense, or
it does. I've gone through the same thing, for years. I've done writing as a hobby, spending hours at a time on it, on the weekends or at night, and it's not recovery related. It's usually creative writing, fiction, that sort of thing.
Now that's different. That's different in my thinking.
Yeah. It is different, but the way I respond to the questions is the same that you do. If somebody asks what I did this afternoon, and I sat and did writing for a few hours, I tell them anything but that.
Mm-hmm.
And not because it's recovery related, because it's not, but kind of the same concern about, I don't want to make this all about me. I don't want the spotlight shined on me. I don't want, my internal, what's going on inside me to come out right now. So yeah, even though it's not, we're not writing about the same thing, kind of the same desire not to have the spotlight shined on ourselves is there. So I was just recognized myself in what you were talking about a little bit. That's why I asked about it.
Yeah, I guess another way to look at this verse, maybe, and I hadn't thought about this since that comment, Drew, is that how much do we shine the light upon what we do, as in pride, ego, those actions that originate from pride and ego, versus what we are, or can we be in that? Asking that premise, that question of how can we be helpful in this response, really? If I'm talking about me, my premise is not how I can be helpful. I'm talking about how great I am. Really, when you think about it, I'm doing this great thing. Maybe I'm being hard on myself, but that's how I look at it.
Yeah, and when somebody asks me, what'd you do this afternoon, and what I did is writing, I know I can look at it as, I don't want to be bragging on myself or something like that. But at the same time, whoever's asking me that sincerely wants to know, a little bit about me. How'd you spend your day? That sort of thing. And if what I did is creative work, then, and I tell them that, then that might inspire them to do the same thing.
Could be.
They may have been kicking that around, but they don't know anybody who does it. It's not something they feel they can do. And, if they learn that I've been doing it, they have questions for me. I can share my experience. I can, without making it about me, just tell them what I've been doing and, answer their questions and share my stories. I think there are sometimes when talking about yourself is one of the best things you can do for the person you're talking to. I think recovery groups are a good example of that. You're sharing your experience not to boast about it, but just to let others know that this is somebody else's experience. This is something I can learn from. Um, there's good power in hearing everybody else's experiences, kind of like Paul was talking about. You read other people's gratitudes, and that just reminds you of even more things you can be grateful for. So yeah, I think it does come down to, what are your intentions? Is the side path, are you taking the side path because the side path keeps people from seeing you? You're on the broad path. There's nowhere to hide there. People can come up to you. They can ask about you. You don't have anywhere to hide, but, are you taking the side path because it is out of the way, because you want to avoid the sun shining down on you? So, yeah, a lot to think about with this one.
Yeah, also, Drew, if it's people I know very well, I have a few friends in recovery that, hey, how's things going? What have you been up to? I'll say, yeah, I've been writing. There's really a good one that came up, a good thing I was writing about this, and I'll talk about, something that really spoke to me if it's appropriate. But most people, I err on the side of not speaking about myself.
Yeah, me
because
too.
unless I know it's going to be something that's helpful, I stay away from that, because normally it's the incorrect thing for me to do to talk about myself. It doesn't need to be my first go-to. I do want to share a story that kind of goes with this. This is from the Chihuahua, and it's the story of the flight from the shadow. And I'm going to share it. Let's see, it would be page, you've got 155 if you've got your book handy. There was a man who was disturbed by the sight of his shadow, and so displeased with his own footsteps that he determined to get rid of both. So he wants to get rid of his shadow and his footsteps. The method he hit upon was to run away from them. So he got up and ran. But every time he put his foot down, there was another step, while his shadow kept up with him without the slightest difficulty. He attributed his failure to the fact that he was not running fast enough. He had to try harder, right? That's how I felt coming into recovery. I want to get sober, so I have to double down, try harder. So he ran faster and faster without stopping until he finally dropped dead. So he died from trying so hard. He failed to realize that if he merely stepped into the shade, his shadow would vanish. And if he sat down and stayed still, there would be no more footsteps. That's the easy, right? The path is easy. Step into the shade, one step, or wherever they say the shade's next to you, just find the shade. Step into the shade.
In other words, surrender, right?
Yes, Paul, surrender. This is the easy path. You find the shade and you go toward the shade. Find the shade and your shadow would vanish. And if you stayed still, there would be no footsteps. Yes. So difficult for me. That's the least amount of action I could take, isn't it? Finding the shade and stopping the walking or running.
I have to say that. Go ahead, Brian.
No, I was just going to say that the frantic trying to find a solution, a quick, easy fix.
Yes.
I was thinking that about the other day. I had this job at work that's just rocked on, and for various reasons, but it just was what it was. And we were right at the end, and I looked at a guy that works with me, and I said, "Slow and steady wins the race." And I don't know where that come from, but it just, and full disclosure, I can get wound up where I'm like the Tasmanian devil and I want to knock things out. And I have to pump the brakes and stay out of Benny's way and not help. And so, yeah, each step's on the path. That's it. Thanks.
Thanks, Brian. Lou, you have something?
I don't know that was really that beneficial. But that silly guy with the shadow I could relate to, because I was out in the woods one time on some property that we owned when I was a kid, and it was wintertime, and I saw some tracks, and I was bound and determined I was going to find out who was trespassing on our land. Of course, they were my tracks, and I followed around in a circle a couple times before I figured out it was my own tracks. So ancient guys aren't any smarter than what this guy is.
Thank you, Luke. When we don't understand something, for me, I double down.
Oh, yeah, I was going to catch that son of a bitch.
Yes. And it's amazing how our first thought goes to something negative like that. So the way is easy and broad when we stop the fight, right? Surrender to what is. And then we learn that this path of sobriety can apply to everything in our life, not just the alcohol or drugs or our addiction of choice. It applies to everything. Just like we surrender and find relief in our addiction, we can find relief in everything else. I'm powerless over business. I'm powerless over relationships. I'm powerless over all these things. I'm powerless on how to drive. I don't have to be angry when I'm driving anymore.
We can find that acceptance of life on life's terms.
Yes. Yeah, Brian, we find out it's not about fashioning life to where it meets our approval. It's about accepting life as it is to where it doesn't need our approval. Even in unacceptable situations, we can be at peace. Then maybe we can see if there's something we need to change or not. As long as I'm fighting, I can't see that. I can't see it.
Pause.
Yes. That's good, guys. I guess today, for me, I'm seeing I just need to stop the fight. I can't see the path. If I'm pushing, I can't see what is moving already, right? It says the man of Tao stands on what's already moving. I can't see that if I'm pushing everything. Once I stop pushing, I can see what's moving without my frantic effort. Yes. And if I don't see it as an easy path, I have those around me that can show me the path they walked and how they walked the path. And maybe I can see the ease through their experience. So where do I go? I look at others' experience. I don't have to do this alone. That's what Paul did. He was a month in. He started looking online and found some folks with experience that showed him how they walked the path. We've all done that in some form. That's why we're sitting here, right? Yeah, that's good. Any other comments, guys? It's been a good conversation today. Thank you.
My sponsor's little comment he makes is he said recovery can be like mudding. He said, you'll see others go in front of you and you're like, that's the path I want to take, or that's not the path I want to take.
Sometimes they're showing us the example of what not to do, right?
Exactly.
Yeah. But if I just slow down and become open, I find that everything is there already presented to me. All I have to do is just be open to it, and it shows itself. That's the way it works for me. That's good. Thank you, guys. Thank you. Y'all have a great week and hope to see you next week.
Hello, this is Buddy C. I wanted to make you aware of several recovery-related resources that I've posted in the episode description. These resources include a list of recovery podcasts, a free sober meditation app, daily recovery email, shared Google recovery calendars. Hope you put some of these resources to use and have a great week.
Thank you for listening to the Tao of Our Understanding Recovery Podcast. If you enjoyed this episode, please share it with your friends in recovery.